And in this discussion series, we're calling Better Together, we discussed right out of the bat, right out of the gate, how God exists in community. And that there's this three-in-one aspect, this dynamic communal energy that is God, that is the divine. And we said that kind of throughout this entire series, the idea we want to discuss, the thing we want to focus on is that God's invitation to the world is for relational transformation, not religious transaction. His invitation to all of us, God wants us to be a part of that dynamic communal energy, to be a part of what's going on in the purposes of the divine. It is not about what can I do to earn God's favor, what can I do to earn God's love, this transactional religion. No, it's about relationship. And God is calling all of us into relationship, and we said so that God invites us to the table and to build a bigger table. And then as a church, at the very core of what we want to do is we want to build a bigger table. We want more and more people to see God for who God is, to come to the table and literally at our church to discuss life and faith and what it means to be human and what it means to have a relationship with God. And so we're building this bigger table, and we actually, our first week of this series, we had communion. We had a huge table, and we had food, and everyone looked each other in the eyes, and we had this conversation, and our leadership team talked last week about how amazing that was. We really, really enjoyed that. We love all the people that came to be a part of that week. And so we called that communion, right? There's this friendship with God, sitting and talking intimately with each other and with God and communing together. And then we said last week that moves us to connection. And we define connection this way, as Brene Brown does in her book, Daring Greatly. Connection is the energy that is created between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued. When they can give and receive without judgment. Again, this energy, right, that is created when people are connected. And I think that energy even grows more when we are connected to the dynamic communal energy that is God, when we are connected. And so we said the best way to become new, because what we all want to do is become better, to transform. The best way to become new is by connecting to others who are committed to becoming new. And so last week we launched our groups. These were very intentional ways for people in the downtown community and beyond to connect with other people and to grow and to become new and to transform. And we have those groups. Those signups are still going to go on this week and next week. And there's still some space in those groups. Very little space in some groups, but there's still some space there. And we'd love for you to sign up afterwards and connect to people and to get better at life and better at faith, connecting to others who are committed to becoming new. And so we had communion and connection. And so this week we're going to take one more step into this, and we're going to look at community. And what does it mean to be a community of faith and that exists within this larger community? And what does it mean to build and create community where community doesn't exist? And so in light of all of this, and to help us do this, I wanted to interview a friend of mine. So join me in welcoming up Dylan Jorgensen to the stage. All right, so there you go, Dylan.
Yeah, just realized my leg was asleep.
No, yeah.
You know, you don't feel it until you stand up sometimes.
Right, you're like, oh, that's asleep. Yeah. All right, so Dylan, when I moved downtown, and I met with one person that I knew that lived down here and was kind of part of the revitalization. And the first person that they said I needed to know was Dylan Jorgensen. They're like, you got to know this guy. So they connected us, and he avoided me for a few weeks. And then finally we sat down and talked. And his title, kind of down here in downtown, part of the revitalization, was like collision expert or collision scientist. Real quick before we jump into talking about community, what is a collision expert? Did you just make that up, or what was?
Well, yeah, I did just make that up.
Oh, okay, cool.
It also has responsibilities, and that. At the time, Downtown Project was pouring a lot of money into rebuilding downtown. My job was to comb through a bunch of the Wi-Fi data that was keeping track of where all the people were moving, and we were trying to come up with a metric that was not money. So the Downtown Project could invest $500 grand in a place like this, and they could say, oh, it's not making us that much money yet, but is there a metric to show that it's on track for like a long-term 10-year, 15-year vision? And to do that, we would look at how many different Wi-Fi cell phones would come through. So everybody's cell phone has what's called like a MAC ID. It's a unique address, so we could actually see when people came into buildings, and even if it wasn't profitable, if it was making a lot of collisions, analogous with connections, then we would consider that like a more valuable property.
Wow, so there was actual science behind that.
Yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
that's really cool. Yeah. So being a part of that, you were here kind of early on with the revitalization. I know that's kind of what brought you to downtown Las Vegas. What does it take? And in your experience, what does it take to create community? Because there wasn't really community down here. And when I got here, I experienced, there is this community going on now. What did it take to create that?
Yeah, okay, so I'm a big fan. There's an author named Peter Block who came up with a lot of these thoughts, but they're things that I've interpreted for years and really liked. And there's kind of 5 main things that I would think of as more of the soft side of building community. And the first one is not defining people or the groups that people are in by their disabilities. So I think it's like kind of common, I'm not a big fan of like when people say stereotypes about political people, like they're like spendocrats, because what you're saying is like, oh, that's the group of people who overspends, which is like the disability they have instead of the things they could bring. Or when somebody is like handicapped, they're not able to be average, like the average person, instead of like whatever skill they can bring. So the first thing is, both like on a personal level and in a group level, I've always thought was to just figure out what the one thing they can do. Like if it's a group of older people, they have like a lot of wisdom. If it's a group of younger people, they have a lot of energy. If it's a group of people who even are on drugs or something, instead of saying like, oh, they're people who are on drugs, find out whatever thing that they can do, or that like maybe they get together and provide some kind of value. So
interesting. Yeah,
so a big part of it is just shifting that conversation until it's subconscious to know what somebody can bring to the table, and then bring them in whenever you can. Or like, like from someone who runs a church, like if you need one of their skills, bring them in and be like, oh, we need a bunch of energy, so we need a bunch of young people, or whatever it is.
Okay.
The next thing is like really fuzzy goals have always been something I was a big fan of. So we don't always do it perfectly, but like at Zappos and Downtown Project, we were supposed to move towards a purpose. And a purpose by its nature isn't like attainable. So making sure that your community and you as a person move towards something that you can continually move towards. So I like the thought of kind of like a compass, like, you're always kind of getting a direction. You're trying to go north, but you're not always exactly sure if you're there yet. You're not completely north ever, but you kind of move towards some kind of purpose. So, like being closer to God isn't a thing you can just, got that solved.
Yep, done. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So that was a good one. Another thing is reaching underneath. When somebody says like they want the world changed, like I need something different to happen in the world, try to dig underneath and find out how they're connected to the thing. And don't take it so I think another thing is like, just don't take, if you're like, oh, the problem is blank, be like, okay, I bet you don't know what the real problem is. What are you connected to in this problem? And find other people that are connected to that same thing, and sometimes they're different people, but they can make a community if you like dig underneath it.
Right.
So sometimes you can find a community, but you just can't listen to what people say. You have to think about how they're connected to what they say. And if you can find similar connections, I think there's a community to be built there. And then like the final 2 things are like having space for dissent, making sure that people I don't like when people quit. Like they're like, I hate this, I quit. It's way better to say, oh, I hate this, like please stay. Like if you don't think we're doing it right, like there's a place for that. Like that's at least now you've taken a side, and you have to explain why you don't like it, because that's way different than just quitting and keeping it out of your brain.
Exactly.
Exactly. And then being like a citizen of thinking of yourself as a citizen, because I think there's this natural tendency from like a psychological point of view to want someone else to be the leader, and then also be relaxed because when it goes wrong, you can blame them instead of like taking some ownership. I mean, I could imagine like a society where we didn't like love when the leader comes in and like changes things, but instead we thought to ourselves, like, let's change it ourselves. And the leader is like the least great position to have. That's the person who has like the least power over the situation. Right. So just that ownership like a citizen in whatever you're doing. So.
Very cool. I love those. Those are really great. And And we're going to talk a little bit about that actually today, some more. So again, think of these things and maybe how they relate to our idea worth discussing. A couple more questions. How did you get people involved in projects to help build community? Because I know your big thing kind of organically happened because I think more and more people got involved. How did you get people, so the podcast, the Downtown podcast you're involved in, how did you get people connected to that project, which certainly did connect people to community?
Yeah, well, I mean, it just starts real small. I mean, I think so if you can just get like the person to your left and the person to your right to like move, I think you really need 3 people. I don't think I think 3 to 5 is like really all it takes to grow something that stays at that size or becomes as like big as like a national movement. So it just starts really small. The podcast was just something that me and Joe and Jackie, my 2 co-founders at Ticket Cake, wanted to do. Okay. And then the guests would sometimes bring people. I mean, very organic, like the same way yours did. And then it, eventually was able to fill like the Inspire Theater. So we moved to a place that could hold it. But that happens all the time. Like most big movements, like the women's right movement was probably like 7 or 8 people to start with.
Right. Right.
A lot of big things happen that. So if you can get those 4 or 5 people like on board with you from the beginning, you just scale it up in the exact same way you built those 4 people, and just make sure you curate the people that are in it, and it can scale up.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, one of the things I loved about the Downtown podcast was the amount of people that were involved, at least at some level, that really brought their energy and their uniqueness to it. It was a really great thing. One more thing, as a leader, and I do consider you a leader of downtown, right? The downtown revitalization. You've done various things, but in every one of them, you've been a leader. What is most important to you when it comes to creating a thriving community? As a leader, what do you see as most important?
Most important. Well, I mean, like Simon Sinek said, like leaders eat last. So I guess the most important thing I would think of as a leader is just living by that same principle that you're trying to get people to believe in you for. Yep. Like if I was like, okay, like, oh, I love this podcast, we're learning about entrepreneurs and all of these things, then I better be actually that way.
Like
not
like an authenticity.
Yeah, like it must, because they're just everyone's gonna pick up on it. So I guess like, I don't, like we just had about, I don't think of leaders are like these people that we can blame for things going wrong. Like we need to be citizens. So I'm not a huge fan of the word leader, but I would say that like if you think of a leader as somebody who just embodies the principles that they believe in and gathers people that also have that same kind of passion.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I would definitely agree with that. That's ultimately what a leader does and is. So, well, if you could say anything just about community in general to our audience while you have them, was there anything that you would kind of say in closing? Any thoughts that you have about community, about a sub-community within a larger community? Or
kind of those main things I talked about before. Like when I think of the word trust, I think of that, like not defining people by their disabilities, by digging under what they say the problem is to find how they're connected to it, finding similar people, moving towards fuzzy goals like a purpose, thinking of yourself as a citizen, and being happy with dissent. Like when somebody doesn't agree with you, just keeping your heart rate down, letting them stay next to you, listening to their point of view, and just still being friends with them.
Like disagreeing well. I think it's incredibly important to community, because sometimes we want to be in a community where people only agree with us, and that's not true community. It's not true relationship, because most of us all have a relationship with somebody, probably a close relationship, that we disagree with at times.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't know what that's like in my marriage, but I've heard that happens. Right?
I thought you said you weren't going to bring your marriage into this.
Yeah, exactly. I probably shouldn't. Well, hey, let's give it up for Dylan Jorgensen and his wisdom on community. Thank you. Awesome. So as we continue, we're going to look at community, and I want you to think about a lot of what Dylan said. Again, I think there's some great value there, and it's going to connect to what we're talking about. So when I think of true community, and when I think of a community of faith and the church, I really always go back to, there's this book in the Bible written by a guy named Luke. And so when you're reading the Gospels, actually if you read Luke and then you read what's called the Acts of the Apostles, Luke kind of just continues the story. So he has his Gospel of Luke where he's talking about Jesus, and then we see where Jesus dies, he's buried, he raises again, he kind of has these meetings with his disciples, his followers. If you just continue reading the book, the Acts of the Apostles, it just continues the story. And Luke does a great job of just kind of having those two ideas flow together. And so what we see happen is that there's this group, and it's about 120 people. And they're really committed to each other, and they're committed to Jesus, but they're not really sure exactly what's going on because Jesus left. And he gave them this purpose, he gave them this mission, he told them what was going to happen, and then he left, and they kind of were like, okay, so let's just pray about it, and let's see what happens. And then some pretty amazing things started happening. And then one day, there's this day called the Feast of Pentecost, which was a Jewish feast. And so Jewish people from all over the world would come into Jerusalem, and they would celebrate. And so these Jewish followers of Jesus, right, like the game had changed for them. They decided to go out and start telling people about Jesus. They start telling them about their experience with Jesus. And they start telling people, like, oh, remember in the Old Testament, we looked at this our first week when we talked about communion, remember Abraham and David and all these people, they're connected to Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of all of these things from our history. And then he starts talking about how Jesus was killed and that he rose again and that they spent time with him. And he starts, Peter specifically has this very powerful message. And then people go, well, what do we do next? And so he starts talking to them about repentance, which is basically turning from this way and going to this new way, this 180, this about face to go in this new path, this new thing, this new way of connecting to God through Jesus. And then something happens. Something, you could say natural, so you could say supernatural, but something happens. And community is built. So let's look at what happens. It says, those who believed what Peter said were baptized and added to the church, or the gathering, right? That gathering was like 120 people, right? So these people were added to that gathering, about 3,000 in all. Now let's say this, if in one day, 3,000 people decided to join Downtown Faith, it would be a lot of fun, right? But there would be some logistical things. So you can imagine all that went on. So he kind of ends this story with this, and then he goes on to describe the community that these 3,000 people began to have. He says, all the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to sharing in meals, including the Lord's Supper or communion, what we had the first week of this series, and to prayer. A deep sense of awe came over them all. And the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders, and all the believers met together in one place and shared everything they had. They sold their property and possessions and shared the money with those in need. They worshiped together at the temple each day, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and shared their meals with great joy and generosity. And the very literal term there in the original language is sincere hearts. All the while praising God and enjoying the goodwill of all the people. So this outside community had goodwill for this sub-community that was starting there. Goodwill of all the people. And each day the Lord added to their fellowship those who were being saved. So the people who were believing this message were getting added. And so it was this 3,000 in one day, but then more and more people continue to get added. It says all the believers were united in heart. And this is over in chapter 4. He kind of gives another rundown of what's going on. All the believers were united in heart and mind. And they felt that what they owned was not their own. So they shared everything they had. The apostles testified powerfully to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's blessing was upon them all. Listen to this next sentence. There were no needy people among them, because those who owned land or houses would sell them and bring the money to the apostles, so that's the church leaders, to give to those in need. This pretty amazing community begins to happen. These people begin to love each other in a very special way. And then we see this natural reaction. And I want to look at this former pastor, his author and speaker. He writes about what happens here. He says, according to Luke, one of the most direct results of the grace of God, this is what they were experiencing, the grace of God at work, is people taking care of each other's material needs. Grace creates a human connection and community, one grounded in real needs being met by real people in real ways. That's what happens when we experience the grace of God, the goodness of God. When we see that the things that we have aren't our own, it's all a grace from God, we begin to share and we begin to have things in common, and we begin to be very generous with the people around us. And this was in the direct community. This wasn't just in the outside community, right? They weren't bringing it into the church and it was going out to strangers. No, it was going to the people who had need that were directly there as part of the gathering. But imagine if there was a gathering, a community going on in your larger community where people's needs were being met. And the people there actually loved each other and they wanted to be with each other. And they were generous and they were sincere. That outside community would be better for it, and they would want to be a part of that sub-community. The grace of God forces us to confront our American individualism and even sacrifice it for the sake of others. There is this idea in America that pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, like you can do it. And while that may be true, what the grace of God confronts us with is, but what are you going to do for the people next to you? What are you going to do for people in your community? How are you going to love and be generous? So our idea worth discussing today is this: God invites us into a community that makes our community better. God invites us into a community that makes our community better. I like to say it this way: a community of faith our community has faith in. I want Downtown Faith to be a community of faith that our community has faith in. They trust us. That if we no longer existed, people in this community would feel it. That the community around us would be like, something is missing. And that's the goal. To be a community of faith that the community has faith in. And so here at Downtown Faith, we believe that there are 4 values that we can live out that will help us be the kind of community that our community has faith in. The kind of community of faith that people want to come in and be a part of. Even if they don't know if they believe like we do, they still feel like they belong. And what goes on in the things that we do in our groups, in our gatherings, at our pub theology, when we serve the community, that those things matter. And so we have 4 values, and you see them in the story that we just read about the church. And the first one is this: worship. Right? We saw them get together and they worshiped. And we simply define this as reflecting back to God and out to others who God is, the weightiness of God, the importance of the divine. And it says that they did this each day. Like sometimes I feel like, man, it's hard enough to get, like, especially churchy church people in church on a Sunday, one day a week, maybe some other things. But we see these people loved each other. This community was there. They wanted to be with each other, and they wanted to do this together. They wanted to worship together. They wanted to give God his due, to display his worth together. That's part of what we want to do here on Sundays. So we call it wholehearted worship. We want to worship every day. But we also want to worship in our gatherings and in our groups in those spaces. But then we see there's another word, and this word's very important. Commitment. Commitment. It said they devoted themselves to each other, to the teaching that the apostles had. Now this was very, very important, and it kind of gets lost on us. In the first century, when this movement began to happen, it was not well received by certain people. So we saw that their community, they enjoyed the goodwill of all the people, right? Like people enjoyed that this was a part of it, but there were people in power who did not like it because it challenged everything that they stood for. So there were Jewish leaders, right? These Jewish people were saying, we no longer need these things over here. It's been fulfilled in Jesus, so we're going to follow Jesus. And they were forsaking their entire family history, their entire religious history. They were forsaking it. I mean, this was thousands of years old. And they were turning and to go into a new direction. And the people in power didn't like it. So when it talks about them devoting themselves to each other and to the teaching, this was a teaching that was not well received. It was not well received by the empire until about 6 centuries in. You study some ancient history, you look at the Roman Empire and what they did to these Christians that were devoted to these teachings. And while they made their communities better, the people in power wanted to arrest them. They wanted to kill them. They wanted to throw them in the Colosseum. So when it talks about them devoting, it took some real courage to commit to this new faith. Courage that I don't even think we fully understand, because their lives were at stake when this would happen. They were devoted to each other and to learning this new way, and it could have cost them their life. But imagine a group of people, a sub-community, a community of faith that was really devoted to what they were taught about Jesus, about loving God and loving others. That could be pretty powerful. That could create a community that your community can have faith in. And then we see this next thing that happened. We see that there was real love, right? There was this real love that happened, this sincerity of heart. They cared for each other. Not love like this feeling or this emotion, but love like this action, this charity, this showing the person next to you how much you actually care about them as a human being. What if a community of faith that existed for a community really, really loved, like until it kind of hurt, to where it really mattered? That's what we want here. We want to be a community of faith our community can have faith in by loving loudly. And then also, we see this word, generosity. We see this generosity that happens where these people, they don't view what they have as their own. They view it as it's all of ours, right? Because you matter, because we're together in this faith, because we know if we don't have each other, we don't have anybody. They begin to be incredibly generous. And they started, like we talked about last week when Paul said, when you have opportunity, do good to everybody, but especially those, the household of faith and your community of faith, those who belong to your community of faith. And we believe that if these four things are characterized in the way that we live our life in downtown, like we're not just a church that meets downtown, we're a church that is for downtown, for its thriving, right? For its families, for its success. It's why we came here. We didn't come here because and then we start something and we want to take it somewhere else. No. We are for downtown Las Vegas because we believe God is doing something here in this community. Because you have everybody from the homeless to the hipster who needs a group of people that really lives what they believe each day, and they worship. They're committed to what they believe and to each other. They love loudly and they give generously. As we discuss today, I want us to really, really think about this. Is this a community we can be a part of? Am I better because of this community? And am I committed in such a way? Am I bought in such a way that I'm actually helping this community make our community better?